Life after insults. Pathetic. Jim heard his mother-in-law grumble as he moved down the hallway past the living room. He didn't bother to ask who had caused her reaction. He already knew. It was him. He had overheard several conversations between his new wife and his mother-in-law since she had arrived from France. It was clear not only that she disapproved of her daughter's marriage, but also that she felt Monique lacked life experience. You need a man who will take control of you, Monique, not some luscious American who gives you everything you want. You don't know how wonderful it is to experience pleasure forcibly while your man takes control of you and makes you his easy girl. Once you completely surrender to his control, it's magic. It's just like nature intended. You give yourself over and your whole body responds to him. Jim almost laughed when he heard his mother-in-law harassing his wife with her theories of human relationships. But Mom, Jim gives me lots and lots of pleasure and he's wonderful. Kind and understanding, and the wife tried to respond. Then he should realize that you need a man who will take you, who will possess you, not kiss your jolie CU, beautiful ass FR, every time you bend over. Her mother was almost outraged at the thought of a man idolizing his lover. Jim met Monique in Vietnam during his second tour of duty as an interrogator. He had been taught French by his mother in Quebec, and the Army stuck him in Monterey, California for a year trying to teach him Vietnamese. Jim didn't feel confident in the Asian language, but had established himself as an excellent interrogator in English and French. Monique worked at the French embassy in Saigon, and she and Jim were introduced to him by a mutual friend. By the end of his business trip, they were going to be married. Only after returning to the States and settling in Fort Holabird, Massachusetts, did he learn that her mother in France disapproved of their marriage when she was informed after the fact. Jim offered to pay his mother-in-law's travel expenses to visit her daughter, confident that she would reconsider her disapproval when she saw how happy her daughter was. He didn't understand why that didn't happen. It only reinforced her disapproval and disappointment in her daughter. Jim, Momo is very much Nasumis, driven, FR. Someone who needs to be dominated. I used to be very worried about her because men would take advantage of her and abuse her and then cast her aside. My father, whoever he was, put her in the hospital when he found out she was pregnant and left her there. She still mourns him to this day, says he was the strongest man she ever knew and still feels like she belongs to him. Jim laughed. Oh, she's nuts! He wasn't bothered by her mother's attempts to waste time trying to convert her daughter. Jim figured that if her mom hadn't succeeded in that so far, it would be okay. Then Jim was informed that his special talent was again required in Saigon, and he agreed to another 6-month tour of duty, even though it meant extending his tour of duty by a full month. Now married, he planned to quit, believing that being a civilian would better support his wife and future children. Monique's mother volunteered to stay with her daughter in the States during his absence, and since this seemed to suit his wife, he agreed. In addition, Sophie had found a man to dominate her in the garrison, Staff Sergeant Jason Stroud of the S2 Battalion. He seemed like a real bastard to Jim, and while he didn't like the way Stroud stared at his wife, her mother seemed to have a knack for controlling him. I was concerned about the bruises visible on Sophie's arms and every other part of her body. I feared I might have to intervene, and with senior NCOs, that was a risk. No, Monique reassured me. Mamo is very happy. It's just the way she likes it. I don't know. I never understood it no matter how much she tried to explain it. Go do your duty. Don't worry about me and Mamie. We're going to be fine. So Jim went to Saigon and did his duty. He and Monique corresponded, and she always assured him that everything was fine, that she loved him and couldn't wait for his return. She ended each letter with the words, "Miss your love." Jim was drafted in Oakland, California, and after returning from Vietnam, was sent to Oakland to serve. Upon completion, he went home to Holabird to move his wife and her mother from their on-base housing. At the airport, Monique rushed to him, jumped into his arms and wrapped her legs around his waist. Their kiss was passionate and seemed to last forever. Finally, they moved to the luggage to retrieve Jim's duffel bag and briefcase. When Monique bent over to pick up the ladder, the sleeve on her arm was pulled up, and Jim saw 3 ring-shaped bruises on it. She had been grabbed and squeezed hard enough to cause the bruises. Jim took her hand and pulled her sleeve all the way up to see the bruises. They weren't the only ones. Monique stared back at him. then withdrew her hand and pulled back her sleeve. "Don't worry, Jim, it's okay." When he wanted to ask her a question, she shook her head and said, "We'll talk at home." The ride home was uneventful. Scenarios ran through Jim's mind. Chief among them was the suggestion that Staff Sergeant Momo was grabbing his wife. Anger was boiling in Jim's brain. By the time they reached the house, he was ready to kill that bastard Stroud. Upon entering the house, Jim instantly dropped the duffel bag and turned his wife around to face him. "So now tell me." "Jim, I love you. It's all right. Let's sit down." Monique pulled him toward the couch and sat down, then waited for Jim to join her. "Jim, I love you. I love the way you make love, but—" She paused, and there was a look of guilt in her gaze that made Jim's heart sink. But Mom's right. There's something about being taken without consent. Jim jumped up. "That bastard your mother obeys touched you," he shouted. "No, no. Mommy would never allow that." Monique smiled nervously. "But he has friends." The phrase pierced his heart. He picked up his duffel bag and briefcase and staggered out to his car. Monique followed him, swearing that she still loved him, and that Momo had assured her that it wouldn't affect their marriage. Jim held back, clutching the keys in his hand until they dug into his flesh. He wanted to kill his wife, her lovers, and her damned mother. He swiftly raised his hand, but stopped its downward motion when his wife shrank back. He got into his car and drove away quickly. For the first 4 months of Jim's business trip, Monique ignored her mother's urgent pleas to go out and have fun, but one evening she gave in. She was bored. She didn't like the other servicemen's wives, and with no children or job, she had nothing to occupy her time. What harm could an evening out do? As it turned out, a lot. Mom's lover had brought a friend to accompany her, was the excuse, and he became her dance partner. It felt good to be hugged by a man. She missed her Jim very much. Drinks poured in rivers. Monique let her hair loose, and her mother encouraged her. Her dance partner's hands roamed wildly over her body, and again it felt good. When he suggested going outside to cool off, she agreed. When he kissed her, it didn't seem like a big deal. When he pulled back her bra and caressed her nipples, they swelled and hardened, sending a wave of arousal through her body. What happened next is unclear, but the sergeant suddenly ripped off her panties and she found herself on the fender of a parked car. "Come on, baby, let's go back." She felt guilty and tried to object as the two sergeants escorted her mother and herself into the house on their return home. Her mother laughed as they dragged her to her bedroom. In the morning, her mother laughed even harder as she remembered, to her daughter's shame, the howling she had heard all night. After that, she found the pleasure her mother found in submission. She loved Jim, but her body reacted to being dominated. It turned her on to be treated like a slave. Over the next 2 months, Stroud and her mother brought in different men, all of whom dominated the young wife. Sometimes one, sometimes several. Her mother's sergeant never made love to her, but Stroud would make Mamie tie her up being naked and then go about his business. It hurt, but somehow turned her on. Watching them increased her desire, and when they brought the men in, she experienced pleasure, over and over, until they untied her. Then she would submit to whoever was brought in. She knew she was thinking wrong. She knew she loved Jim, but even his sweet caresses couldn't give her pleasures like this one, much less the kind she felt after a good night. She let her mother convince herself that Jim would understand her, that her calm husband wanted her to be happy. Everything would be okay as long as she explained it to Jim. So Jim came back from Vietnam, but when she tried to explain it to him, he was gone. Jim had gotten his combat pay and had decided on his destination. He has no family. He was an only child, and his parents died during his first deployment. He inherited their house in the Oakland Hills and rented it out to a childhood friend and her family. He'd called ahead of time from St. Louis, and Felicia had assured him that the guest room was always open to him. He couldn't figure out what to do. His wife had admitted to cheating on him, but he had no proof, so could he get a divorce based on adultery? He didn't think so. On the other hand, they didn't have any property other than his parents' house that his before their marriage, so There is no pressing need for any legal action. Monique and Sophie could go to hell. Let them work it out for themselves. He settled into the guest room and soon something of a family member. He willingly babysat Felicia and Mark's two girls, who at 6 and 4 years old loved to climb all over Uncle Jim's house. He used the Servicemen's Reintegration Act to go to college again, where he'd managed to do 2 years before his service, and the California state college system was cheap enough that the Veterans Assistance Program payments were enough to live on, with rent from Felicia added on, though he cut back since they sheltered him. He'd always wanted to study engineering, and he'd finally gotten the chance. He didn't date, though Mark and Felicia constantly encouraged him, to the point of asking beautiful women to dinner. He explained that he was still married and that it was wrong. When Felicia asked about divorce, he explained that he had no proof of adultery and didn't care at this point. He hoped, that eventually Monique would file because of his abandonment. In the meantime, he didn't want her to know where he was. Felicia shook her head. "You're not in Maryland anymore, you're in California. Reagan signed the Family Law Act in 1969. Here, you can get a divorce based on irreconcilable differences, which could be anything, and doesn't require any proof." Using his Army connections in Maryland, he was able to track down Sophie, still living with her domineering staff sergeant. From there, it was easy to find Monique, who was cohabitating with another sergeant. There she was served with divorce papers. Upon receiving the divorce papers, Monique cried. She hoped that someday Jim would realize that he loved her and come back to save her. She wanted to contest the divorce, but her owner, Marty, stopped that. "I'm gonna own you, stupid. Let that asshole divorce you." The excitement of being dominated and treated like a slave had dissipated after Jim left. The other lover that Stroud had given her to was pounding her into the mattress when she realized he didn't even talk to her, spitting on her feelings. She realized that she wasn't being dominated, that she wasn't being treated like a slave. She decided then that she would change. She would work on getting back with Jim no matter what it cost her. How could she have been so stupid to give him up? She lay on the bed and cried, mourning what was and what was to come. She could still feel Jim, feel what peace with him had been like. There had to be a way to go back, before all this stupidity and readjustment. Some way to get back to Jim. But then Marty showed up. She'd gone out with him a couple times. He was stronger and more physically gifted than her other lovers. When she tried to explain to him that she was no longer available, he grabbed her by the hair and slapped her. Earlier, she had thought it was just an expression. Turns out, it wasn't. Marty had forced her to move in with him. Now he was her dominant, her master, as he insisted she call him. She belonged to him. Even the tattoo on her testified to that. He made it clear. He didn't love her. She belongs to him. She belongs to him so he can use her any way he wants, share her any way he wants, abuse her any way he wants. Until she got the papers, she dreamed Jim would save her. Now she was destroyed. When Jim graduated from California State College in San Francisco, the best graduation present he received was the decision to divorce. He decided that before he settled down, he would go traveling in Europe. He realized that a European bus pass was inexpensive, and that by staying in hostels he could see Europe on the cheap. He packed the bare minimum necessary, kissed his foster family goodbye, and flew out of San Francisco International Airport. 2 months later, he was in Amsterdam, almost out of money and ready to return to the States. Europe had been an adventure for him, and the hostels were filled with girls from the U.S. and other countries who had their own adventures and willingly accepted betting. His new bachelor life had begun, and he was emotionally ready to start living again. He bought a return ticket for tomorrow. With the last money he had, it was only enough for the last night in the hostel and the bus ride to the airport in the morning. He went shopping. What he had left, he spent on gifts for Felicia and the girls. Toy windmills, Miffy dolls, and cheese balls were all he could afford, but he knew the girls would love it. Walking along the canal, he waved his bags and suddenly heard a scream. On the other bank, a little girl had rolled her toy scooter too close to the edge of the canal and, losing her balance, rolled down a stone embankment into the water. Without thinking, Jim dropped the bags and, shaking off his jacket, ran across the bridge to get closer to the girl and then jumped off the bridge into the water. The bridge was higher and the water not as deep as Jim had expected, and he plunged into the water, into the mud at the bottom. His feet sank into the water and the mud clung to him as he tried to free himself and reach the girl. Eventually, he stopped being sucked in and managed to break free, losing one shoe in the mud. As he surfaced, he found himself next to the girl lying face down in the water. Turning her over, he saw that she had hit her head on a rock wall and was bleeding. He pulled her to the stairs where some old man was screaming in panic. Hands reached out and took the girl from him. Before he could get out, he saw the scooter slowly sinking and swam to retrieve it. Hands reached out to him to help him get out. The girl was being carried up the stone steps by what later appeared to be a chauffeur, and the old man, limping, was climbing after them. While Jim watched, they loaded into a limousine and drove away. Jim smiled, left the scooter with the people on the landing, and went to get his bags and jacket. They were gone, along with his plane ticket, wallet, money, and passport. He leaned against the railing of the bridge and wondered how he was going to get home. The only thing that came to mind was to go to the U.S. Embassy and see if they could help. But he didn't know where the embassy was. Was it in Amsterdam or The Hague? Maybe there was a consulate there? He decided to go back to the hostel to get his backpack and see if he could at least take a shower there. As he limped out, he realized that among other problems, he needed shoes. And how do you buy shoes without money? Now he wished he'd gotten one of those newfangled credit cards, American Express or MasterCard, but he'd never felt the need before. The very thought of going into debt, buying things he hadn't paid for yet, he hated it. But then he laughed. Even if he had one of those cards, it would be in his wallet, in his jacket, and it would be stolen along with the cash. As he walked down the sidewalk, limping and bleeding, he noticed that a car had stopped next to him. It stopped, and a man in a chauffeur's livery got out. He addressed Jim in Dutch, and Jim shook his head. "English or French?" he answered. "Excusez-moi, monsieur. Are you not the gentleman from the canal?" The chauffeur used both languages in his reply. Jim laughed. "How did you find me?" He laughed back. "I was told to look for someone wearing the same shoe and wet." "Well, that's what I am." Jim reluctantly got into the limo, but not because he had no idea who it belonged to, but rather because the dirty, smelly canal water was still dripping off it. He really wanted to go back to the hostel and take a shower until he caught conjunctivitis or some other infection from the dirty water. But Aldert, the chauffeur, insisted. He would take Jim to the hostel to get his backpack and then to his employer's house so he could shower and have dinner. Since the fact that Jim had not included dinner in his budget, and that was negated by the theft of his money in a stolen jacket, Jim agreed to the plan. As Aldert pulled into the wide driveway, Jim realized that this was not a house, but a palace. It was one large detached mansion with adjoining gardens. Jim hadn't realized that Amsterdam had such luxury. On the steps of the main entrance stood the same old man who had been with the little girl. When Jim got out of the car, the old man came over and hugged him despite Jim's resistance. Apparently, the Dutch are not bothered by stinky canal water. The man spoke in Dutch when Aldert coughed delicately and said, "American," whereupon the old man easily switched to English. "My dear boy, how can I thank you? You saved Annalise, my granddaughter. You were so quick, so brave, so splendid." Jim was embarrassed by the fuss the old man made. "I didn't do anything, sir. Just happened to be close by and jumped into the water, that's all, mister." "Van Ooyen, Lars Van Ooyen," the man introduced himself, shaking hands. "I'm Jim Meadows. How's the little, how did you say, Annalise?" "Yeah, Annalise. She's fine, a little bump on her head, but nothing serious, thanks to you." He took Jim's hand and led him toward the house. "But let's get you to the shower and change you into something clean." Later, dressed in his only spare clothes, no shoes, he didn't have another pair of boots, and decided that putting on his only remaining soaked boot would be worse than just staying in socks, he felt decidedly underdressed in the formal dining room, in his worn jeans and white t-shirt, when dinner was being served by a pair of footmen or something. Jim felt like he was back in the Regency era, even though the waiters were dressed in simple black pants, white shirts, and he thought black jackets from Ike. The food prepared by Lars's chef was the most delicious he had ever tasted. Lars sympathized with the losses Jim had suffered on the canal. "Aldert said you were robbed on the canal. You should let me recoup my losses." Well, there wasn't much there. The most important loss was my passport and my plane ticket for tomorrow. I think I'll need to go to the embassy tomorrow. Other than that, I lost some money in my jacket and gifts I bought for friends. You have nothing to worry about, sir. Jim paused. Perhaps Aldert can take me to the embassy tomorrow, here or in The Hague. Your embassy is in The Hague, but we have a consulate here in Amsterdam. I'm sure they can help you there. I'll call and make an appointment for the morning, Lars replied confidently. A woman in strict brown clothes entered the room, holding the hand of a little girl, Anneliese. The little girl smiled when she saw her grandfather and pulled away from the woman to run and jump into his lap. "Grandfather!" she shouted. With a wide smile on his face, Grandpa hugged the girl and then, placing her on his lap, introduced her to Jim, telling her that he was the brave man who had jumped into the canal to save her. Jim was again embarrassed at the praise, but the girl jumped off her grandfather's lap and ran to Jim to hug him tightly. Then, looking intently at him, she said in a very grown-up voice, "Thank you, sir." Jim laughed and said, "You're welcome, miss. You sound just like an American." She indignantly replied, "I am an American. I live in Delaware." Suddenly there was the sound of a door slamming shut, and someone called out to Anneliese. The girl's face lit up. She squealed, "Mommy!" and ran out of the room. This was followed by the sound of a falling purse and loud kisses. Soon Anneliese returned, holding the hand of a young woman in her 20s or 30s. Lars rose and went to embrace his daughter. When the greetings were done, Lars led the woman over to Jim, who also rose and stood next to his chair. "And this is Jim Meadows, to whom we owe the rescue of our Anneliese. Jim, this is my daughter and Annaliese's mother, Mila Borden." Mila held out her hand to Jim and began to thank him profusely, and Jim again insisted that he had not really done much. Finally, everyone sat down again at the table, where Mila and Anneliese were now eating dinner. Jim has to go to the consulate tomorrow to get his passport replaced, but I think we should take him to Pack-In first tomorrow to buy new shoes. He lost his in the canal. He can't walk around in one shoe, can he? Lars teased. Mila laughed. And I wondered about the socks on his feet. Even for an American, it looks too frivolous. Jim blushed. Puckend? Is that a shoe store? Well, they make all our shoes. They'll have a pair for you before we go to the consulate. I have a pair of slippers you can wear until then. After which Lars added, Jim also lost his plane ticket home. Someone stole his stuff while he was in the canal. The plane ticket is not a problem. He can get back on the corporate jet with me and Anneliese. That's the least we can do for our hero, isn't it, Anneliese? She asked her daughter, who nodded enthusiastically. Would you mind postponing your return for a week, Jim? I'd like to spend some time with my father before I return. Of course, no one is expecting me now, but I'm going to California, not Delaware. I'm sure I can get home from there, though, he admitted. Lars intervened. I'm sure we can get you home. In the meantime, you'll stay with us as a guest. When Jim tried to object, he continued, and that's final. No arguments. The next day, Jim was given a shoe order in Puckend, but was given a pair in his size to meet immediate needs. He was amazed at the fit. They are the best shoes he has ever owned. As he left, the clerk assured him that the other shoes would be ready in 3 days. When he objected to Lars that it was too expensive, Lars simply said, Nonsense, my boy. Jim was surprised when Lars was received at the consulate by the consul general himself. He was taken under his arm by the attaché and was promptly given a replacement passport with a new photo taken by the consular photographer. The consul general assured Lars that the passport would be ready and delivered to his home the very next day. On the way home, Lars stopped at several stores and bought expensive gifts for Felicia and the girls to replace the stolen ones. When Jim realized how much the gifts would cost, he protested, but Lars insisted. A necklace for Felicia and bracelets for the girls, toys that filled the limo's large trunk. They hadn't forgotten Mark, giving him a Patek Philippe watch. Jim objected again. He figured that with the value of those gifts, Felicia and Mark could buy several houses in Oakland. But nothing could change his host's mind. Nothing could be too much for the friends of my granddaughter's hero. Finally, Jim got through to Lars, threatening to leave if Lars didn't tone it down. Lars was visibly shaken by this threat. "Please don't do this. Mila and Annalise will be hurt if you leave them." His eyebrows rose. "And they'll blame me." Jim smiled, looking at the old man's stunned expression. "Lars, please, no more talk of heroism and no more awards. Helping me get my passport, settling me in my home, and helping me get home is more than enough. Please return all these gifts. There is no need for them." Lars agreed, but he didn't understand this American. He had saved the most precious thing in Lars's life, Annalise, but he refused to be grateful. After agreeing to return the extravagant gifts, he secretly planned to send them to Mark and Felicia at the address on Jim's passport. Jim learned that Lars owned LVO Holdings, which was a family business, but ranked 12th on the list of the largest Dutch companies. Mila married an American, John Borden, Annalise's father, and ran LVO's American operations out of Delaware. Although she had returned home out of concern for her daughter, she now had to take care of business at headquarters while she was in the country. But she still had plenty of time to spend the rest of the week showing Jim her country, taking him and Annalise around Amsterdam, The Hague, the beaches of Zeelandia, Gouda, Edam, and Limburg, until Annalise begged not to watch any more cheese being made. Mila laughed and pointed out that cheese was very important to their dairy-rich country. Jim found Mila surprisingly easy to talk to, especially considering her upbringing and wealth and her position in the corporation. He questioned Lars about her position in the company, and Lars spoke proudly of his daughter's virtues and business acumen. Jim was impressed. On their last evening in Holland, Lars and Mila sat Jim down at the table and asked him what his plans were for the future. He honestly answered that he was undecided. He had just graduated from college, but after 8 years in the Army and 4 years of college, he was 30 years old and had no experience in engineering. He doesn't expect employers to be busting down his door, but his plan is to look for a job as soon as he gets back to California. Sure enough, Lars and Mila offered Jim a job. They own factories in Delaware where they could use a reliable engineer. Jim thought, they are good people, and as far as he understood their corporate philosophy, that kindness extends to their employees. He was about to agree when Mila added, "The salary will be $150,000 a year plus benefits." Jim was stunned. A good salary for an engineer would probably be less than $70,000. Damn, he thought. This is just another hero bribe. They don't really need me. They just feel the need to reward me. Jim stood up. "I'm tired, and it's going to be a long day tomorrow. I'm going to go to bed now." He looked at Lars and Mila and shook his head. "No, thanks for the job offer, but no. I think I should look for a job on my own." With these words, he turned and walked out. Lars and Mila looked at each other in amazement. They had tried to make the job offer as attractive as possible. They couldn't imagine that Jim would turn down such an offer. Lars shook his head. "Why would he refuse? Haven't we offered enough? He's a good man. I was really hoping he'd join us." Mila sighed. "No, Daddy. I think we've offered too much. Jim is a man who wants to be appreciated for who he is. He doesn't want to be bought, and he feels that we are being too generous with our thanks and appreciation for saving Annalise." She sighed. "I like the man. He reminds me of John." Lars liked the son-in-law. He wasn't too rich himself, but he still refused to accept any help or financial income from his wife's relatives. He prided himself on providing his wife and child with whatever they needed. John believed that Mila's money was her money, and she could do whatever she wanted with it, and it was his responsibility to provide what was necessary to live. Both Mila and Lars thought he was ridiculous, but Lars had to respect his independent son-in-law. When he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, Lars spent a fortune trying to get John the best treatment, but to no avail. He passed away 2 years ago. Lars, Mila, and Annalise are still grieving for him. Sophie looked at her daughter in shock. Her sergeant had been transferred to Fort Huachuca in Arizona when the U.S. Army Intelligence School, USAINT, was moved there. Sophie hadn't seen her daughter in over a year. Now she was shocked. What have you done? Monique stood with tears in her eyes. She had a tattoo of a slave collar around her neck and card spades on both ankles and her left shoulder. How could you do that to yourself? Monique looked at her mother through her tears. You, Mom, told me that I had to give myself to a dominant man, that it was the only way I could be truly fulfilled. You made me give up a loving man for one who beats me and pimps me out. I told you to obey, not to be a stupid girl, Sophie replied indignantly. How dare her daughter accuse her of ruining her life? She had been a role model for the girl all her life, but she couldn't tell the difference between their situations. Bullshit, she hissed. When I fight Marty, he hits me. I'm bruised and scarred from his punches. I have broken ribs where he's kicked me, and twice he's deliberately broken my fingers. I hate him, but I have no money. I have nowhere to go. I have nothing. Nothing. Monique pulled herself by the hair and moaned in despair. You're coming with me. Stroud is being transferred to Fort Meade to join the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. If Marty objects, I'll have Stroud report him to the Army Command and he'll be kicked out. She called Stroud and asked him to come over to help move her daughter. Jim was impressed with the Learjet corporate jet that carried him, Mila, and Annalise back to the States. It had a crew of 3, pilot, co-pilot, and steward, 3 separate sleeping cabins, and a main cabin with ministerial chairs, a couch and a full bar with a full beverage service. A true luxury. They took off after 6 p.m., before saying a tearful goodbye to Lars, after which Aldert took them to a private hangar. They ate dinner on the airplane and planned to go to bed, sleeping the entire flight. Annalise insisted on sitting on Jim's lap after dinner to delay bedtime as long as possible. When she dozed off, Jim carefully carried her to her assigned cabin and left Mila to tuck her into bed. Upon her return, Mila offered Jim a nightcap, which he gladly accepted. He had already come to appreciate Lars's taste in whiskey. Handing Jim the glass, she apologized. I'm sorry about the job offer. It was clumsy of us, but we really wanted you to join us. You made an impression on my dad, and that old man, believe it or not, is not easy to impress. I appreciate that. I really liked him too. And he and his family are all very impressive. Jim smiled at Mila, clearly admiring her. But you're all so amazing, I just can't understand. I'd be lost in your world. With those words, he drained his glass, set it down, and reached for Mila's hand. Without hesitation, he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. Then he smiled again and went to his bunk. It was a minute before Mila realized she wasn't breathing and suddenly inhaled sharply. There was something about Jim. An hour later, Jim woke up to someone's hand brushing his hair away from his forehead and lips gently touching his lips. When he opened his eyes, he saw a pensive Mila, dressed in a black negligee, looking at him. I couldn't let you go without telling you that you touched my heart. What? Jim rubbed his face, trying to come to his senses enough to understand this woman. Ik hou van jou, I love you, Dutch, she whispered, leaning forward and kissing him again. That woke Jim up. Shocked, he leaned back against the bulkhead. He didn't understand what she said, but it sounded too intimate to be innocent, especially in that black negligee. You're married? What about your husband? About his wife, she already knew. He had told her. How could she think he would do that to another husband? Jim, my husband died 2 years ago, cancer, she whispered quietly. Jim sat still, absorbing the new information. It was true that while he had told her about Monique and Sophie, she hadn't talked about her husband. He watched as a tear appeared in Mila's eyes and ran down her cheek. He reached out and caught it with his finger. She squeezed his hand and pressed it to her cheek. But you hardly know me. How can you... Jim stopped. What you said? What? I love you, Mila whispered, moving over to the bed. 2 years later, Annalise kissed Daddy goodnight as Mila and Jim prepared for a dinner and a play in Baltimore with Mila's business associates. Unlike John Borden, Jim realized he couldn't fund a lifestyle at the level Mila and his daughter, which he considered Annalise to be, deserved. He resigned himself to luxuries, but limited what his wife and father-in-law could give him. He had been seduced by the marvelous puckened shoes, He did not understand how he could ever walk in other shoes, and because of the dinners and meetings to which he accompanied his wife, had allowed her to acquire a closet. The shoes were now joined by suits from Savile Row, tailored shirts from Hong Kong, silk ties from Japan, and casual clothes that cost more than all the clothes Jim could think of in his entire life. But he decided that compromises and sacrifices were necessary in a marriage, so he would have to put up with it and endure. While his wife wielded power in the corporate world and her family was worth more than the GDP of some countries, Jim happily worked as an engineer in a factory outside Wilmington, earning $77,000 a year. He used his salary to take his wife and Annalise on vacations and day trips, although he used the corporate jet. He was well employed, working where he liked and doing what he understood. He had a wife and daughter whom he loved, and he was immensely happy. Mark and Felicia thought he was crazy. As a belated wedding present, he gave them his house and sent gifts to their daughters, but he couldn't compete with their adoptive grandfather. Several times a year, Lars traveled to Europe with Annalise. All three girls were like sisters, and Lars enjoyed spoiling them all. Mark especially thought Jim was crazy. He had no trouble wearing his Patek Philippe watch, and Felicia adored her necklace, though she rarely wore it when she learned how much it cost. It's in a safety deposit box. As Jim and Mila were leaving the Martix restaurant in Baltimore, Mila felt Jim suddenly pull her to him. Looking to see what was wrong, she saw that he was looking at two women walking down the sidewalk. When they saw Jim, they stopped abruptly as well. The younger of the two women gasped. "Jim!" Mila felt her husband make an effort to relax. "Monique," Jim said smoothly and expressionlessly. Mila flinched as she recognized Jim's ex-wife's name. She stared at the woman, scrutinizing the tattoos on her neck and ankles. From Jim's description, this was not what she had expected to see. Monique was wearing a shapeless dress with long sleeves and a bodice buttoned all the way up to her neck. She looked haggard and miserable, perhaps even more so after meeting her ex-husband, but the wrinkles of grief on her face were nothing new. "Nice tattoo." Mila marveled at the pettiness Jim showed. "I hope you found the joy you were looking for in dominance?" Mila realized that her Jim wasn't being petty. He was shocked. Monique's face drained. She turned and, sobbing, ran in the opposite direction. Sophie stared after her daughter, then turned to Jim. "There was no need for that, you pathetic man." Mila, knowing the woman's history, blurted out, "No, not pathetic, sensitive, compassionate. Jim is a good man. It's you and your daughter who are pathetic." She reached over and pulled Jim to her. "Not my husband, and he dominates me. He dominates me with tenderness, with love, with care. Go away, you evil, vile woman." As Mila dragged her stunned husband into the limo, Sophie could only stare at her in amazement before finally turning around to find her daughter and take care of her. As they pulled away from the sidewalk, Mila clung to her husband, enclosing him in her arms. "What do you say we skip the play? I can apologize to the Brown Millers tomorrow." Jim clung to his wife and, breathing heavily, suppressed a sob. "I loved her. How could she do this to herself? Why? Why, Mila?" Her strong husband was shaken by sobs. Mila hugged him tightly, feeling deeply for her husband. Should I have left? Had I done that to her? Would I have been able to save her if I had stayed? Mila pushed her husband away from her to look him in the eye. "No. How can you think that? It's not your fault. It's only her and her mother's fault. If you had stayed, it would have ruined you too. You did the only thing you could." She could see in his eyes that he still felt guilty. He was happy, but Monique was destroyed. It gave him no pleasure, ... It hurt him to see the one he loved suffer. Mila's heart was bursting with love for this man. What if we help her? Maybe a psychiatrist? Maybe someone could remove those hideous tattoos? Whatever she needs, we'll help her, okay? What do you say? She pulled Jim to her again and laid her head on his chest, hearing his breathing and the pounding of his heart. "Do you want to do this?" "Yes, please," Jim sighed. "Can we go home now? I want to hug you and Annalise. I need to remember how good life is." Mila decided to save the surprise she had planned for Jim for another night. She can't wait too long. or it will be obvious that Annalise will have a sibling. Eventually, Monique's wish came true. Jim came to rescue her, though they never saw each other again. Mila outsourced everything to a third party, and through counseling, removal of tattoos and piercings, and some plastic surgery to remove scars on her body and buttocks, Monique began to find, if not happiness, then balance in her life. She never married, never dated again. She went back to work and took a job in Washington as a translator, doing mostly legal documents. It was very similar to what she'd been doing all those years at the Saigon embassy. In her spare time, she volunteered at a charity for abused women. No one was surprised that she didn't date or socialize with anyone at work. Everyone assumed that a single woman of her age, between 45 and 50, had long since turned into an old maid. No one would have believed that she was barely in her 30s. The end